Okay, let's talk a little bit about reading a scholarly article. As I'm sure you already know, reading a scholarly article is a pretty different process than reading a popular article, such as one from a magazine or the newspaper. And it's certainly different from a lot of the reading that we do for pleasure, particularly fiction reading. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about reading a scholarly article and some strategies that I use to help me whenever I'm doing that. So first and foremost, this article is the same one that appeared in the earlier video. So it's the result of our ERIC search. The title is Inquiry-Based Learning and Its Possibilities for Primary Schools with Fewer Digital Resources, a Qualitative Study. Now, something that I like to do as soon as I download an article and start to look at it is sort of scroll through it and see how it's organized. Often journals will include the bibliographic info somewhere prominent on the first page. Sometimes it's on a separate page that's kind of like a cover sheet, and that's really helpful, I think, as well. So I can see that this was published in 2018 in the journal Pedagogical Research, Volume 3, Issue 3. It begins apparently on page 12, but it doesn't show me the full range of pages. It just shows me like page 3 out of 8. Sometimes that's because a journal isn't paginated because it's perhaps an online journal. And sometimes that's just a convention of how it is converted to a PDF. That's something that you can think about if you do intend to present the results of your research. So perhaps you'll present at a conference, either a state conference or a national conference, or just in a professional development session with your colleagues. So you want to find all of this bibliographic info that you might need to write a reference for this, a citation rather, and then to be able to point to different parts of the article. I can also see the author here and the author's email address. The corresponding author, in my experience, wants to hear from you if you have questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them if there are things about the article that you want to learn more about or you have questions about, particularly if you're thinking about how the article connects to your own action research project. Most scholars and researchers are more than happy to talk about their work. Just like everybody else, researchers love to talk about themselves. So if the corresponding author's contact info is included, feel free to do that or to reach out to them. And then they have a suggested citation here. Remember that this isn't always in APA format, which is the standard for education research. So the first thing I do whenever I'm reading an article is read the abstract. This is a really short summary that tells you what the topic of study was, briefly how the study was conducted, what was observed or what data were collected, and then what were the results and their interpretation by the author. Now, this doesn't give you all of that in great detail. It's typically about a one-sentence summary of each of those components, but reading the abstract can help you figure out if you should continue reading the rest of the article. One of the things that you should also keep in mind when you're reading an academic article is that, particularly in education, they're highly structured, and using the headers, you can sort of jump around in the article. You don't have to read the whole thing, and you don't have to read the whole thing in order. So after I've read the abstract, I might want to read the introduction. Typically, this is where the big idea gets introduced and perhaps the author's research questions. Then, and you can see here the research question, or is the research question. After this, there's typically a section where the author reviews the literature, and that's exactly what's happened here. Inquiry-based learning with digital tools. If I have already started swimming in the literature myself, I might just need to skim this section, especially if I see some names of other researchers who I know I've already read their work. Then you'll find typically a section on method or methodology where the researcher talks about how they conducted their study. Now, this can be of particular interest to you, the action researcher, as you're thinking about what kind of intervention you might include in your classroom, and then how you'll go about gathering data and analyzing and interpreting those data. So depending on where you are in the process, the method section might be pretty significant to you. If you're not at that point yet, this might be a section that you skim and then come back to later when you're more focused on designing your research. And some of the headers can be pretty different. You can see here that we have the settings, so the research context is described. Then the data are reported in a couple of different tables. There's table 1, there's table 2, as well as these narrative sections that are reporting on results or findings from the study. Then is the discussion. As you can see here, in this article, the discussion is relatively brief. Sometimes your discussion will have a separate conclusion. Sometimes the discussion will be the conclusion. Sometimes you'll have a directions for future research section. Again, as an action researcher, that might be really helpful as you're thinking about how you're going to conduct your study. So you might get some inspiration there. If I were reading this article, again, I would start with the abstract. I would probably read the introduction. Depending on where I was in terms of exploring the literature, I would read carefully or skim the literature review. Then I would probably read the discussion before going back and reading the methodology section and the section where the data are presented. Again, the order in which you read an article depends on you and your needs at the present time. And it doesn't have to be the same every time you read an academic article. 2 additional points. I encourage folks to make a lot of notes while they're reading. You can make those notes digitally in Acrobat. You can add sticky notes or in whatever PDF reader you use. That's typically an option. I still like to print things and read and then make scrolling notes in the margin. So however you like to make notes, I encourage you to make notes while you're reading. I also encourage you to look at the references before you put an article away. So one of the things that is particularly helpful in an article like this is seeing who's cited in their literature review and looking for names that appear frequently. So if I start to read about using inquiry-based learning in non-science classrooms and how other people have explored that through action research, and for instance, I see the name Hammond appear in 6 out of 8 of the articles I've read, then I know that Hammond is an important scholar in this field, and I can more specifically seek out things that author has written that could be of interest to me. So just to review, scholarly articles are typically structured very carefully. This structure is helpful to us because it lets us jump around and read what we need when we need and not necessarily in order. While reading, I recommend taking notes, including notes that are questions and things you're wondering about. And don't forget to check out the references to help you as you continue your scholarly literature review.